On the 4th of July, 1776, a small group of men signed their names to a piece of paper that accused an empire of tyranny. They had no navy worth the name. Their army numbered in the thousands, not the hundreds of thousands. Their treasury was, for practical purposes, empty. Few in London or Madrid or Paris expected the new republic to survive its first decade. And yet within 2 lifetimes, this same country would station soldiers on nearly every continent, make its currency central to global trade, and make foreign governments plan their next move around what happens in a single city on the Potomac. The small republic survived. Then it expanded. Eventually, it built a form of power the old empires would have recognized, even if Americans used a different name for it. So tonight the question is not whether America became powerful. Everyone agrees on that part. The question is how a country built on resisting an empire turned into something that looked increasingly difficult to distinguish from one. And why, more than 2 centuries later, the word remains so uncomfortable in American political language. Start with the map, not the myth. In 1783, the year Britain formally recognized American independence, the new United States looked, on paper, like a serious stretch of territory. In practice, it was closer to a narrow band of settlement clinging to the Atlantic coast. To the north, British territory. To the south and west, Spanish territory. Vast, largely unmapped by Americans, and legally closed to American trade. Beyond the Appalachians, dozens of native nations controlled land the new republic claimed on paper, but did not control on the ground. And running down the middle of the continent, the Mississippi River, the one route that could carry Kentucky tobacco or Ohio wheat to a port, and from there to the world, answered in practice to whoever controlled New Orleans. That was Spain. Soon, it would be France. The new government was weak, deeply indebted, and still uncertain whether 13 states with competing interests could hold together at all. The states argued constantly over taxes, trade, and how much authority any central government should even possess. In its first decades, the United States did not feel like a rising power. It felt surrounded. American leaders had a specific answer to that feeling of being surrounded, one built on a promise no European empire had ever made its colonies. Thomas Jefferson called his vision an empire of liberty, his own phrase, used more than once in his private letters. New territory would not answer to a governor appointed by a crown 3,000 miles away forever, the way Britain's colonies had. In time, it would become a state, with its own legislature, its own representation in Congress, the same standing as Massachusetts or Virginia. That promise was made to the settlers arriving on the land. The nations already living there, with their own governments, languages, and law, were never asked whether they wanted to join this empire of liberty at all. In the spring of 1803, that question stopped being theoretical. The American minister in Paris that spring was a man named Robert R. Livingston, a wealthy, imposing New York aristocrat known for decades simply as the Chancellor, after the highest judicial office in his home state. People who met him described him as baronial in bearing, the kind of man a room noticed before he had said a word. Livingston had been sent to France with one narrow instruction: negotiate for New Orleans, and perhaps West Florida, so that American farmers west of the Appalachians would finally have a port they could rely on. Nothing more was on the table. Nothing more was supposed to be. Then, in April, France's foreign minister, Talleyrand, one of the most practiced diplomats in Europe, asked him a question Livingston had not been sent to answer. What will you give for the whole? Not New Orleans alone, not the port alone. All of it, the entire Louisiana territory, a stretch of land that would roughly double the size of the United States in a single stroke. Napoleon needed money, and he needed it quickly. War with Britain was closing in, and he had already told his finance minister, in his own words, that trying to hold Louisiana by force would be folly. Livingston understood, sitting in that room, that he was being handed a decision no instruction from Washington had prepared him to make alone. That night, he rode home with details he dared not risk falling into the wrong hands. encoding the sensitive lines of his letter, sentence by sentence, before sending it to Madison. 11 days later, on the night of April 13th, Livingston sat across the table from France's finance minister and signed the deal. A treaty agreed in a single evening in Paris had just more than doubled the territory of a country whose own negotiator had never been authorized to ask for it. Nobody at that table could say, with any precision, where the new territory actually ended. When Livingston pressed Talleyrand for the eastern boundary, the French minister only said he could give no direction. Livingston and Monroe, he added, had made themselves a remarkable bargain, and it was now theirs to make sense of. For the next 20 years, that single, unanswered question would sit at the center of border disputes with Spain. A nation had just changed size by roughly 1 million square miles, and the men who arranged it were not entirely sure, that same night, where its edges actually were. The news would take weeks to cross the Atlantic. By the time Washington learned what its envoys had done, the ink in Paris had long since dried. On a desk in Paris, several million square kilometers changed hands over the signatures of perhaps 4 men. On the ground, in the territory itself, almost nobody knew yet that foreign governments had just changed the flag above their land without asking them. Not the Osage, not the Quapaw, not the French and Spanish families who had lived along the Mississippi for generations, under a flag that had now changed for the 3rd time in living memory, without a single one of them casting a vote on any of it. The purchase also changed how the Republic itself made decisions. Congress still had to approve the treaty. The people already living in Louisiana were never asked. The Republic had expanded first and dealt with consent afterward. Livingston and Monroe had gone to Paris to secure a port. They came home having doubled the Republic. Jefferson had already begun preparing an expedition west before the deal with France was ever on the table. After the purchase, its mission took on a much larger meaning. Lewis and Clark were to map the rivers, catalog the resources, establish relations with native nations, and record which nations held which land. They set out from the Mississippi in the spring of 1804, more than a year after the purchase was signed, and long before anyone back east had a clear sense of what the expedition would actually find. The journey would later be remembered as adventure. Its instructions read closer to reconnaissance. Empires do not always begin with soldiers. Sometimes they begin with a man holding a notebook, a compass, and a blank map, and someone else, somewhere, deciding later what to do with what he found. In less than 1 generation, a republic that had spent its first years afraid of being swallowed by the empires around it had quietly begun doing some of the swallowing itself. It had not fired a shot to do it. It had only signed its name. Buying land on a map in Europe, it turned out, was the easy part. Removing the people already living on that land would take decades of treaties broken, renegotiated, and broken again, each one moving the same line a little further west. And in the century that followed, the United States would discover that the fastest way to grow was not to wait for land to empty. It was to declare that the land was already available, even while other nations were still living on it. Look at 2 maps of the same country, one from 1800, one from the end of that same century, and you would be forgiven for thinking they show 2 different nations entirely. In the first, the United States clings to the eastern half of the continent, edged by rivers and mountains it does not fully control. In the second, it stretches from the Atlantic to the Pacific, 4,000 kilometers across, tied together by rail. That change happened inside a single human lifetime. Someone born the year the Constitution was ratified could have lived to see a train reach the Pacific. Was this luck, geography, force? It took all 3. Favorable geography, extraordinary opportunity, and sustained force. And the story of how it happened does not begin with a battle. It begins with a signature on a different kind of document. one that gave the federal government a legal mechanism for moving native nations west and opening their homelands to settlement. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law. Popular memory tends to flatten what that act actually did. At the time, it was a genuine constitutional crisis, pitting a Supreme Court ruling against a president and a state that simply chose to ignore it, not a footnote to one. The Cherokee Nation became one of the principal targets of the removal policy that followed. It was not a scattered people waiting to be governed. By the 1820s, it had a written constitution, an elected government, its own newspaper, and decades of formal treaties signed with the United States, the same kind of treaties the U.S. signed with European powers. In 1832, the Supreme Court, under Chief Justice John Marshall, ruled that Georgia could not impose its laws inside Cherokee territory. Georgia ignored the ruling. The federal government did not enforce it. The Cherokee Nation's principal chief through this entire crisis was a man named John Ross, Kuiskui in Cherokee. Ross was born into a family of mixed Cherokee and Scottish ancestry and was educated in English-language schools. Under leaders including Ross, the Cherokee Nation had built many of the institutions removal's supporters claimed Native peoples lacked: a constitution, a legislature, a newspaper, and a permanent capital. It made no difference. In December 1835, a small minority faction of Cherokee leaders, without Ross's approval and without the backing of the elected National Council, signed the Treaty of New Echota, agreeing to removal on the government's behalf. The overwhelming majority of the Cherokee Nation opposed it. The United States government chose to treat it as legally binding on everyone regardless. The elected Cherokee government had never approved it. In 1838, the U.S. Army and state militias forced roughly 16,000 Cherokee people west along what became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died from disease, exposure, hunger, and exhaustion during the removal and its aftermath. Among those who died was Ross's own wife, Quatie. She died along the route and was buried far from the home she had been forced to leave. Ross kept leading his nation west, then kept negotiating on its behalf in Washington for the rest of his life. He was still doing that work in that same city the day he died, nearly 30 years later. If Indian removal showed how the United States expanded within land it already claimed, the war that followed showed how it expanded past its own borders entirely, into a country that had, only a decade earlier, invited American settlers onto its own soil. In 1845, the United States annexed the Republic of Texas, a republic that had broken from Mexico 9 years earlier. Mexico had never recognized Texan independence and considered annexation an act of aggression outright. The immediate dispute was a river. Washington said the border was the Rio Grande. Mexico recognized the Nueces as the boundary, about 150 kilometers farther north, while Texas claimed the Rio Grande, despite exercising little control over much of the land between them. Between them lay a strip of land claimed by both countries and fully controlled by neither. President James Polk ordered American troops into the disputed strip between the two rivers. When Mexican forces clashed with them there in 1846, Polk told Congress that Mexico had shed American blood on American soil, a claim a young congressman named Abraham Lincoln would later challenge directly in Congress, demanding Polk name the exact spot where that blood had supposedly fallen on land nobody disputed was American. It was a challenge made on the floor of Congress before the peace treaty had been signed, not a judgment historians imposed a century later. Congress declared war anyway. By 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended it. Mexico recognized the loss of Texas and ceded an enormous northern territory that included present-day California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of several other states, and the United States, in a single signature, reached the Pacific Ocean for the first time. 3 years before the war ended, an editor named John L. O'Sullivan used a phrase in an 1845 magazine essay supporting the annexation of Texas, a phrase that would outlive both the essay and nearly everyone who first read it: manifest destiny. He was arguing for one annexation, but the phrase changed more than one debate. Expansion was no longer presented as one policy among many. It became the future itself. A policy can be criticized. A destiny cannot. A senator could vote against a war. A newspaper could oppose annexation, but opposing destiny made a person sound as though they opposed the country's future. Expansion also created winners: land speculators, settlers seeking cheap acreage, and businesses hoping to reach new markets all stood to benefit. Cherokee communities, Mexican citizens, and dozens of other native nations had no place in that political argument. The future was being debated in Washington, while the people already living in its path were excluded from the vote. Claiming land on a map was one thing, making it functionally American was another, and that took more than a treaty. Gold, discovered in California within a year of the war's end, pulled tens of thousands of settlers west almost overnight. A transcontinental railroad completed in 1869 did the rest, linking the coasts in days instead of months. The Homestead Act offered parcels of federal land to settlers who occupied and improved them, much of it land previously taken from native nations. Army forts rose along the new rail lines to protect them. The buffalo herds that Plains nations depended on for food, shelter, and trade were reduced from vast herds to the edge of extinction within a generation. The destruction was driven largely by commercial hunting, but some military officers openly welcomed it as a way to break native resistance on the plains. A railroad does not sound like a weapon. On the plains in the 1860s and 70s, it functioned like one, moving soldiers, settlers, weapons, and supplies across distances that native resistance could no longer match. The same decades very nearly broke the republic that was expanding. Every major territorial expansion reopened the conflict over slavery, whether it would spread west, and whether the political balance between free and slave states could survive. That conflict exploded into civil war. When it ended, the federal government that emerged from it was stronger, its industry larger, its railroads more extensive than before the war. A country now structurally ready to look past its own coastline. By the century's end, the railroad had reached the Pacific. The continent was, in the language of the maps, finished. It is tempting to think the story ends there, that a country which had gotten everything it wanted, coast to coast, would finally stop. It did not stop. It simply ran out of continent. And within less than a decade of the census declaring the frontier line gone, the United States would look past it entirely, toward islands, ports, and territories thousands of kilometers from its own shore, in a version of expansion the Republic had never openly practiced before, and was not yet ready to call by its name. In 1890, a government office issued a sentence that looked, at the time, like routine bureaucracy. The superintendent of the census, reporting on that year's survey of settlement, wrote a single dry line into an official bulletin. There can hardly be said to be a frontier line. That was the whole announcement. No ceremony, no headline. But a country whose political imagination had long been shaped by land beyond the settled frontier had just been told, in the flattest possible bureaucratic language, that the land had run out. The old frontier line, at least in the language of the census, had disappeared. The political effect was larger than the sentence itself, and the question nobody in Washington had quite worked out was what a country like this one was supposed to do next. The anxiety that followed was not really about land at all. It was about momentum. American businesses wanted new markets. The Navy wanted coaling stations, since steam-powered warships could no longer sail the world on wind alone. And European powers were, in these same years, dividing up what remained of Africa and Asia among themselves, each new claim reinforcing the idea that a serious nation needed territory beyond its own coastline to be taken seriously at all. The direction had changed, the logic had not. If America waited, another power would arrive first. Hawaii shows how expansion could begin without a conventional invasion. By the 1880s, American sugar interests dominated the kingdom's most important export industry and had grown accustomed to shaping Hawaiian policy from behind the throne. In 1887, a coalition of businessmen and armed political opponents forced King Kalakaua to accept a new constitution, remembered today as the Bayonet Constitution, for the armed militia that stood behind the men who presented it, that sharply reduced the monarchy's power and restricted the native Hawaiian electorate. When Liliuokalani took the throne in January 1891, she sought a new constitution that would restore authority to the crown and expand political rights for native Hawaiians. Her opponents organized first. On January 16, 1893, Marines from the USS Boston landed in Honolulu, officially to protect American lives and property. They did not storm the palace, but their presence made unmistakably clear which side had the backing of American force. The next day, a small group of Hawaii-based businessmen and political leaders declared a provisional government under Sanford B. Dole. Liliuokalani yielded under protest, stating that she was surrendering to the superior force of the United States until Washington could review what its representatives had done. The overthrow was organized inside Hawaii. American officials and troops gave its organizers a leverage they did not possess on their own. By the time annexation became possible, American businesses already controlled much of Hawaii's economy. Military conquest was unnecessary. Economic leverage had already prepared the ground. In 1895, after a failed counter-uprising by her supporters, Liliuokalani was arrested and imprisoned for 8 months inside her own former home, Iolani Palace. Believing she might not leave the palace alive, she spent part of that imprisonment translating the Kumulipo, the Hawaiian creation chant, into English, so that the record of her people's own account of the world would survive her, regardless of what happened next. She would later write her own memoir of the overthrow, in part as a direct appeal to the American public and Congress. It did not stop annexation. Congress approved annexation in July 1898. The formal transfer followed the next month, and Hawaii became an organized U.S. territory in 1900. Weeks before that annexation was finalized, a different crisis had already pulled the United States into a war that would give it its first large overseas possessions. On February 15, 1898, the battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana's harbor, killing roughly 2/3 of her crew. The first American inquiries blamed an external mine. Later investigations reached different conclusions. A 1976 review argued that an internal coal bunker fire was the most likely cause. Later analysis reopened the possibility of an external blast. The cause remains disputed. The political effect does not. Remember the Maine became a national rallying cry, and in April the United States went to war with Spain. The war was framed, from its opening days, as liberation, freeing Cuba from Spanish rule. Congress even passed a specific amendment renouncing any U.S. intention to annex Cuba itself. That promise would not travel with the war to its next stop. The war itself was brief. Spain, defeated within months, ceded Puerto Rico and Guam and transferred the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. Filipino revolutionaries under Emilio Aguinaldo had already been fighting Spain for their own independence and had declared it themselves in June 1898. Many expected that American intervention would help secure Philippine independence once Spain was defeated. Instead, the Treaty of Paris transferred authority over the islands from one foreign power to another. Fighting between American and Filipino forces broke out in February 1899 and continued for years. Roughly 4,000 American service members died. Estimates of Filipino military deaths commonly range from 12 to 20,000. Civilian deaths likely reached into the hundreds of thousands, though historians still disagree sharply over the total because most of those deaths occurred beyond formal battle reports, through disease, hunger, and displacement. American soldiers testified before a Senate panel that the water cure, a form of forced water torture involving repeated near drowning, had been used against Filipino prisoners. Their accounts described a practice officials publicly tried to minimize. Theodore Roosevelt's administration presented such abuses as isolated, even as sworn testimony suggested they were not. Back home, the war the Philippines produced was contested at the time, by Americans living through it, not by historians judging it later. The American Anti-Imperialist League, formed in direct response to the annexation and counting figures like Mark Twain among its members, argued it violated the very principles of the Declaration of Independence, that no people could be justly governed without their consent. Supporters of annexation argued the opposite, that American administration would bring order, modernization, and eventually self-government on America's own timeline rather than the Philippines. Congress had passed the Teller Amendment specifically to promise Cuba would not become an American possession. No equivalent promise was ever extended to the Philippines. One war produced independence for Cuba and American rule over the Philippines. By 1904, President Theodore Roosevelt gave the new posture a formal doctrine. Announcing what came to be called the Roosevelt Corollary, he declared that chronic wrongdoing by nations in the Western Hemisphere might require the United States to exercise an international police power over them. That single phrase did something new. It did not claim new territory. It claimed the right to judge other governments and act on that judgment. Power without the paperwork of a colony attached to it. Over the next 2 decades, successive administrations combined loans, customs supervision, naval pressure, and marine deployments across the Caribbean and Central America, in Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Nicaragua, among others. The goal was often control without annexation, stabilize repayment, shape local governments, and withdraw without adding another formal colony to the map. By the early 20th century, the United States held island territories across 2 oceans, a navy built to project force globally, and a self-declared right to police an entire hemisphere. The government rarely described this system as an empire, even while its critics, including the Anti-Imperialist League, used the word freely. By then, the United States possessed many of the features associated with empire, but it remained younger and less extensive than its European rivals. Britain still ruled the seas and a quarter of the Earth's population. France still held a vast colonial territory across Africa and Southeast Asia. Germany was pressing hard to claim its own place at that same table, and increasingly willing to risk a war to get it. What would finally separate the United States from all of them had nothing to do with a battlefield of its own choosing. It came from watching the old empires of Europe do to each other, twice, in the space of a single generation, what none of America's rivals had ever managed to do to America itself. In July 1944, John Maynard Keynes arrived at a hotel in the New Hampshire mountains, already exhausted and seriously ill. Years of wartime work had worsened a heart condition that would kill him less than 2 years later. He had come to help design the financial system the post-war world would use. He would lose the argument that mattered most, what that system would be built around. Keynes was one of the most respected economists alive. Yet reputation mattered less than the financial position of the country he represented. To understand why, go back 30 years. By 1914, the United States had become the world's largest industrial economy, but Europe remained the center of global diplomacy and imperial power. Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire governed enormous territories and dominated the international system. President Woodrow Wilson maintained formal neutrality after war began in Europe. American finance did not remain neutral for long. Britain and France needed food, weapons, raw materials, and credit, more of all four than their own economies, stretched thin by 3 years of war, could still supply. Before 1917, American banks supplied much of the financing. After the United States entered the war, the federal government extended billions more. Long before American soldiers arrived in large numbers, American production and credit had become essential to the Allied war effort. For more than a century, the United States had borrowed from Europe to build itself. The war reversed that relationship. Europe had become the borrower. America had become the creditor. Even so, when the war ended, the U.S. did not step into the leadership role its new financial position might have suggested. Voters and Congress rejected permanent political commitments in Europe, even while American finance and trade remained deeply international. The depression that followed in 1929 emptied banks, closed factories, and, at its worst, left roughly a quarter of the workforce without a job. Hardly the profile of an unstoppable rising power. World War II exposed the full advantage of America's geography, resources, and industrial base. The United States fought on two fronts without its continental industrial heartland ever becoming a battlefield. Its factories, farms, and railroads emerged from the war undamaged, at a moment when Britain's cities had been bombed, France occupied, the Soviet Union had lost tens of millions to invasion, and much of Europe and Asia lay in ruins. None of that diminishes what Soviet, British, and Chinese forces paid to win the war. By most measures, they paid the far higher price for it. What made the American position unusual was narrower and more specific. It emerged with its industrial capacity greatly expanded, while the industrial centers of most rivals and allies had been damaged or exhausted. American factories became what the era itself called the arsenal of democracy, turning out ships, tanks, and aircraft not only for its own forces but, through the Lend-Lease program, for Britain, the Soviet Union, and China as well, while still keeping its own civilian economy functioning on a scale no other major combatant could match. By 1944, with Allied forces advancing in Europe and Japan still fighting across the Pacific, the Allied powers turned to a quieter question: what the world's money would run on once the shooting finally stopped. This is the meeting Keynes had traveled to New Hampshire to shape. By nearly every account, he lost. Keynes proposed an international unit of account called the Bancor, managed through a global clearing union built to spread financial power across many nations. No single national currency would sit at the center of the system. Harry Dexter White, representing the U.S. Treasury, proposed a different structure instead. Other currencies would be tied to the dollar, and the dollar would be tied to gold. Keynes may have been the most famous economist in the room. White represented the country holding most of the leverage. For 3 decades, gold and debt payments had flowed west across the Atlantic. By 1944, Britain needed American credit far more than the United States needed British approval. The final agreement reflected that imbalance. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank emerged from the conference. Both were headquartered in Washington, inside a new financial order in which the dollar occupied the central position. The following year, Keynes returned to Washington to negotiate an emergency American loan Britain badly needed but accepted on painful terms. He died in April 1946, only months after the agreement was concluded. The Soviet Union sent representatives to Bretton Woods, but ultimately declined to join the institutions created there. The refusal previewed the division that would soon split the post-war world into rival systems. What the United States built after 1945 looked, on its surface, nothing like a traditional empire. Instead of colonies, it built alliances. The Marshall Plan helped finance Western Europe's recovery rather than occupying it with American soldiers, channeling billions of dollars into rebuilding factories, farms, and currencies battered by 6 years of war. NATO, founded in 1949, tied the United States to the defense of Western Europe. West Germany joined the alliance 6 years later, in 1955, while Japan entered a separate security partnership with Washington. France remained an independent ally throughout. West Germany and Japan, defeated and occupied, passed through years of occupation before emerging as sovereign states, major economies, and long-term American partners in their own right. This was not colonial rule in the British sense, but the relationships were not among equals. The same country supplied credit, military protection, access to its market, and the currency at the center of the Western financial system. That gave Washington extraordinary influence over the rules of the order its allies had chosen to join. Consent and leverage are not opposites. A country may enter a system willingly and still find that the cost of leaving grows with every year it remains inside. For the next 4 decades, that system stood opposite a rival one. The Soviet Union held its own bloc together through ideology, military force, and a competing economic model. The first real test came almost immediately. In 1948, when the Soviet Union blockaded land routes into West Berlin, the United States did not send tanks to break the blockade. It sent airplanes, flying food, coal, and medicine into the city around the clock for nearly a year, until the Soviets reopened the roads. The airlift demonstrated another source of American power, the ability to sustain an operation at a scale and duration few rivals could match. Because direct war between 2 nuclear-armed powers risked catastrophe, much of the Cold War moved into proxy wars, covert operations, arms races, and competition for allies rather than direct war between Washington and Moscow. American and Allied forces fought directly in Korea from 1950 to 1953 and later in Vietnam. Wars fought to contain Soviet and Chinese-aligned influence rather than to seize new American territory. Elsewhere, U.S. and British involvement in the 1953 overthrow of Iran's prime minister and the CIA's role in the 1954 overthrow of Guatemala's government are now well documented in declassified U.S. records, interventions justified at the time as anti-communist necessity and judged very differently by the governments and populations on the receiving end of them. Some of these interventions reflected a real, documented rivalry with a nuclear-armed adversary. Others removed elected governments or supported authoritarian allies that shared little with the democratic values the alliance system claimed to be defending. Security and principle did not always point the same direction, and when they diverged, security tended to win. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Soviet rival had disappeared. The American-led system, built on alliances, institutions, and the dollar, remained global, intact, and without an equivalent competitor. A traditional empire measures its reach by the flags flying over foreign capitals. By 1991, the United States could shape events far beyond its borders without turning most of those places into formal colonies. The next question this story has to answer is not whether that system had power. Power, by 1991, was no longer seriously in dispute. It is what kind of empire calls itself something else entirely, and whether, by the time the century ended, that word still fit what was left standing at all. Look at a world map today and search for American colonies. you will find several territories in the Pacific and Caribbean: Puerto Rico, Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa, the Northern Mariana Islands, home to millions of people who hold a complicated legal status. American in many respects, without full voting representation in the government that holds authority over them. But nothing there resembles the vast, colored blocks that once marked the British or French empires on the same kind of map. By that measure, America may not look like an empire at all. The color on the map is the wrong measure. Start with the bases, hundreds of them scattered across dozens of countries. Then the dollar. Then the companies and technical standards used far beyond American borders. None of them turns another country into a formal colony. Together, however, they create influence on a scale older imperial maps were never designed to show. Across this story, American power has taken three forms, and each one solved a problem the last version had run out of room to solve. The first was territorial, expansion across a continent, one purchase and one removal at a time. The second was overseas, island possessions, naval stations, and the asserted right to police the Western Hemisphere. The third relied less on ownership than either. Governments remained formally independent, but many of their choices passed through systems in which American security guarantees, finance, markets, technology, and standards held disproportionate influence. Territory had not disappeared. It was no longer the only measure that mattered. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. The decision effectively ended the monetary arrangement created at Bretton Woods 27 years earlier. Other governments had received little warning. That November, finance ministers from 10 major economies met in Rome to negotiate the disruption that followed. John Connally, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, reportedly answered their complaints with a line that became famous. "The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem." The phrase captured the imbalance. A decision made in Washington had altered currency markets far beyond the United States, because much of the international monetary system already depended on the dollar. The dollar never returned to gold. It remains the dominant reserve currency and one of the central currencies of global trade and finance. Central banks hold more of their reserves in dollars than in any other currency. Oil, and much else besides, is still commonly priced in dollars, regardless of which two countries are doing the trading. And because so much of that trade eventually clears through the American banking system, access to dollar clearing gives Washington enormous financial leverage. That power does not require an occupation. Restricting a bank, company, or government's access to dollar networks can apply pressure across borders without a single soldier crossing them, a form of reach no purely military empire ever possessed. American firms occupy central positions in cloud computing, mobile software, payments, entertainment, and online platforms. The infrastructure a growing share of the world's economic and social life now runs on. Nearly all of these companies are headquartered in the United States, and therefore subject to American law, even when most of their users live outside the United States. Their products do not dictate what users believe, but they influence which services are available, which rules govern access, and which governments can demand data or impose restrictions. None of this makes any single company an arm of the state. But when companies matter enough, the jurisdiction they answer to becomes a form of leverage in its own right, often without any direct instruction from Washington. The same reach also carried costs. During the Cold War, Washington backed interventions and authoritarian partners in the name of containment. After 2001, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan showed how military superiority could produce occupation without producing political control. Sanctions offered a way to apply pressure without invasion, but their effects often reached civilians as well as the governments they targeted. All of it has left deep distrust, rooted in experiences that many countries remember very differently from Washington. None of that erases the genuine differences from empires past. Most American allies joined this system by choice, at a moment when the alternative on offer from the Soviet bloc looked considerably worse. They kept their own governments, laws, and formal sovereignty. The post-war order coincided with an extraordinary expansion of global trade, production, and living standards across many regions. A rising tide that, while it never lifted every boat equally, lifted far more of them than the century before it had. Many countries prospered inside the American-led order. Some also found that challenging its rules came with a price. Both facts belong in the same history. New rivals are testing that structure now. China has built its own lending and infrastructure networks, extending credit and construction projects to countries the older system had mostly left waiting. Russia has relied on military power, energy exports, and regional coercion to preserve influence around its borders. A growing number of countries that have long depended on American markets, security guarantees, or dollar finance are now asking, in public and in private, whether they can reduce that dependence. No international order remains unchanged forever. The question is, what replaces this one, and whether the replacement distributes power more widely or simply concentrates it somewhere else. 250 years ago, 13 colonies fought a war against rule without consent. The country they created expanded freedom and political participation for millions. It also displaced native nations, took overseas territories, and repeatedly acted beyond its borders without the consent of the people most affected. After 1945, it built something different from the colonial empires that came before it. Allies joined by treaty, defeated enemies became sovereign partners. American markets, security guarantees, and institutions helped support decades of recovery and growth. The same system also concentrated influence. Dependence on American protection, finance, markets, and technology could make disagreement costly, even for governments that remained formally independent. Freedom and control grew from the same roots. America never stopped expanding its power. It changed the instruments through which that power moved. America's power was never one shape. It was a settler crossing a continent with a notebook and a compass. It was a chief losing his wife on a forced march and continuing to negotiate for his nation for the rest of his life. It was a queen translating her people's oldest chant inside the palace where she was now a prisoner. It was a fleet sailing into the Pacific, a factory arming a world at war, and a room in New Hampshire where the country holding the credit also held the stronger hand. By the end of the 20th century, the United States did not resemble the old empires that colored entire continents on a map. Its allies were not provinces, and its influence was never absolute. Yet territory is only one way power can be organized. The maps have all been drawn. What remains unsettled is whether empire disappeared from them or simply learned to operate through things a map was never designed to show.